Welcome back to Cyber Talk with Nikolai. Today we're going to discuss part 2 on Unpacking National Cybersecurity Strategy with Jim Ross. No, that sounds great, and definitely you brought up a lot of good points of good sides and some of the bad sides. So one concern, and when I was looking, and I'm pretty sure you can relate to it from the past, like when disrupt and dismantle. That's kind of interesting concept, and before these organizations were not actively engaged in countering adversaries, and more was okay, somebody attack us, we're gonna defend, and then life goes on until next attack comes, and then we'll try to do the same thing again, and not trying to engage the adversaries and go after them. So how do you see? And one of the issue was, and I'm still kind of grappling because it's not the same as somebody is launching a kinetic missile or something is coming. You know exactly what location it was launched from, and then you can go after it and retaliate or counterattack and deploy your forces and take care of the business. Versus in cyberspace, attack can come from even companies on US soil against companies on US soil, so somebody knows, and it's kind of like everything happens through the proxies. So to me, it's a little bit I'm in favor of it, but at the same time, without knowing who exactly behind the keyboard that you're trying to hit, you may incidentally or accidentally attack the organization that was essentially the victim. So they've been compromised, and somebody used them as a jumping point and the last mile to attack another organization. And now, if incident responder on the other end is not careful enough to say, "Oh yeah, I think this organization is going after us, and I'm gonna launch my retaliatory strike," so that's kind of where I have my a little bit hesitation on this disrupt and dismantle, but I also have seen successes that U.S. government was working with SecureWorks and other organizations when they dismantled pretty big ransom factories, so to speak, and organizations that were sending tons of bots and spams. So how do you see that point?
Yeah, your point is a really valid point in that attribution is not an exact science in cybersecurity. It never has been. There are there's many situations where in the private sector, I'd have to make a decision. How likely is a particular attack vector, um, and understanding who the potential adversary is and what their motivation is was part of the calculus of how likely is that to happen to our enterprise, and therefore what steps do we need to take to protect ourselves. But it's not a perfect science, and it's in some cases you got to use judgment. And so your point is, well, we did it on, or have done it, will do it on the private industry side of the equation. But from a federal government perspective, when we have offensive capability that we're unleashing on potential threat actors, what are the risks associated with that, and how are we going to do that? And um, none of those questions are answered in this document. However, we saw an event that was made public last week, uh, by Brian Krebs, that the government worked collectively with private industry to take down a major network syndicate, criminal syndicate network, and we've seen past successes with that have often been a collaboration between a individual company or several companies in cybersecurity with federal agencies, and the sophisticated resources that federal agencies can bring to bear. And I think the way I interpret the document and the strategy is we as citizens should expect more of that. Uh, how the federal government is doing that in terms of level of attribution that wasn't mentioned, it's not clear. It, it is readily apparent that some of our nation state sponsored threat actors, just through the consistencies of their behavior, make it a little bit easier to identify, likely attacks and attribution of those attacks to specific individuals and organizations. So I'm thinking of Russia and their really sophisticated capability to create controversy and ultimately potentially conspiracy type activities in a democratic country just through sharing disinformation and misinformation. And they have a high level of skill, a demonstrated track record over many, many years of doing just that, of creating factions of friction within democratic countries that ultimately underlie the viability of the democratic uh, principles, and in many cases the infrastructure supporting in our case in the U.S. it would be voting, and so the question is, well, what's the threshold of attribution that's necessary before there's pillar two here of offensive capabilities deployed against some of our enemies. Again, none of that is clear in the document, but what is clear and provides clarity from previous policy is that is a cornerstone component of our cyber resilience approach and strategy, and we'll likely, the way I interpret that, we'll likely see more of that in the future rather than less of that in the future, despite the challenges with attribution.
Got it. So yeah, that's a tough question, but yeah, it's I'm still struggling with this, and definitely I'm pretty sure some organizations will have the same questions, and hopefully that will get addressed. Who should be engaging and how the process should work, so people are not gonna get into trouble more than they already have. And I'm
Yeah.
pretty sure something is gonna come out. And so, how would you see as far as collaboration and putting more people together? Will this essentially the National Cybersecurity Strategy engage more organizations coming to the table? Because as you mentioned, and we've been at the same table when formed National ISAC organization for healthcare, and there are some organizations are willing to step up and put it wide open and said, "Hey, I'm here to help, and I'd like to contribute with whatever I can." And on the other side, you can see people that have reservations, like, "Well, I don't know how this information is going to be used, and
Hmm.
are there any laws, or are there any areas in executive order that can essentially facilitate and have this engagement at the broader scale, so organization wouldn't really hold back all the information, just like you mentioned in the previous question, because those are essentials. And I've seen actually right now when I do respond to incidents, some organizations are willing to share information. It's like, hey, don't attribute to me that happened, but go ahead and use. And others is like, well, I have all this FBI and everyone else working on the case, so I cannot really tell you anything and I cannot release anything. So essentially, they delay information that could be vital for other organizations to defend themselves. And it's
Hmm.
been there for a while. So how do you see this strategy changing and bringing people closer together and provide maybe some form of immunity? When somebody is sharing information, nobody can go against them just because they shared the information.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and certainly one of the major challenges for putting together comprehensive cybersecurity policy and direction, like what we are looking at and talking about today, is that it's very easy to be broad brush in direction without a lot of specifics about the mechanics of how that's going to work. In this case, you're talking about the mechanics of information sharing and the consequences in some cases of information sharing, certainly in the private sector, that have to be considered prior to sharing incident information, as an example. On the one hand, there's really three levels of collaboration that's called out in the policy. The first is collaboration within federal sector, within agencies that have like capabilities and information, and trying to have more of a cohesive plan for sharing information across different agencies and working more collaboratively towards a common goal. So that's one element of it. The second is the public-private partnership, which in the document is very consistent with what CISA is doing in practice, of having notable cybersecurity experts working collaboratively with them to identify priorities, but also having a significant amount of outreach programs and capabilities to share information with the private sector in the evolution of cybersecurity practices and ultimately regulations. So that's kind of the second dimension. The third that is mentioned is working collaboratively with other nation states, friendlies, Five Eyes kind of thing, that where there's more broad-based sharing of information, both for legal enforcement of criminal activity in a collaborative way, but also in terms of dealing with threats like what we face Ukraine with Russia from a cybersecurity perspective, which is a key component of their aggression, is what can we collectively do across nation states, working collaboratively together to further resilience on behalf of really every digital citizen. So those are three levels that are called out specifically, that require collaboration and working together. Having said that, there is some conflict. You look at the SEC regulations that are manifesting themselves. On the one side, getting board level involvement in cybersecurity is, I think everybody would agree, is a good thing. But then forcing enterprises to identify cybersecurity incidents to the federal government or a federal agency at a specific point in time based on some specific criteria. That's where the practicality of this gets very difficult to implement in some of the trade-offs. So try to, as a hypothetical, if every enterprise decided to follow that future mandate of responding with incident information, the agencies that have oversight responsibility would be totally overwhelmed by the volume, and wouldn't really be able to make a lot of sense of the information. So there's a practical reality that we have to deal with. The policy is well intended. It has a directive that's asking for collaboration and sharing of information, but there's some practical limitations to the mechanics of the sharing of that information. So certainly ISAOs, ISACs, you mentioned, play a fundamental role in information sharing within an industry, and taking some leadership in establishing those relationships to share in the public sector as well, in terms of federal governments as well as local and state governments. So there is a collective that is necessary to lift the burden from the individual consumer, digital consumer, who's at risk and exposed today, to having more resilience built into the infrastructure and software that we use, so that there's less of a risk to the individual consumer and a greater level of resiliency that's fostered across the commercial sector and the federal sector. So there, in any major strategic directive like this, you're going to have some things that don't quite fit with practical reality on the ground today, and have to be addressed over time. And I think you've pointed out a couple of those things, and I would say that's kind of the norm. There was, I'll give you one example. There was consistent reference to a software bill of materials as a attempt to get greater resilience in our software supply chain, which is a positive thing to emphasize and focus on. But there's a lot of uncertainty today. CIS is trying to, and it is doing a relatively good job in bringing different parties, private and public parties, together to figure out the mechanics of how to share an SBOM, as an example, and how to share multiple versions of SBOM as software changes. There are a lot of practical challenges to the enforcement of an SBOM for a commercial off-the-shelf software provider for the federal government, even though that's a mandate that's going in place, how that's actually going to be performed is still kind of being worked out. So the good news is, there's mention of this going forward, which should have a substantial or potentially a substantial impact on protecting the software supply chain, at least if nothing else, making it more evident and where we have weakness that can be addressed more quickly. And that's all good, but the actual mechanics of how to do that and how to share SBOMs at different levels of point, that's still kind of being worked out. Um, there are two things that I noticed that are not included in this that, from my perspective, are missing. But that's just my perspective. The first is I'd like to see an endorsement and enforcement of the DMARC standard, simply to reduce business email compromise in an environmental way across enterprises. And these DMARC standards have well established, been around for 20 years, but we're talking about adoption of this at maybe a 10% level across private industry. So I'd like to see that significantly higher, and I'd like to see the government play a role in enforcement of that a little bit more aggressively. It wasn't even mentioned as something, and I think that's a missed opportunity. The second thing is a little bit more controversial, but and maybe less established, but I'd like to see the federal government actually force federal agencies to eliminate passwords within a specific period of time, like a 2-year time frame, and replace it with passwordless technology. Now, the reason for that is so many cybersecurity breaches are the direct result of credentials being harvested or credentials being shared, basically misuse of credentials. If you eliminate credentials in terms of passwords, you have a substantial lift in resiliency across enterprises, and that's public and private sector. So that's kind of a missed opportunity from my standpoint. I'd like to see kind of a nudge, a push towards both the federal sector and the private sector to, there are lots of choices for passwordless technologies today. Pick one. It doesn't matter which one you pick, but that's something that would have a material impact on resilience across all enterprises, private and public. So that's kind of a missed opportunity. There's another, I think what the SBOM's mentioned, but if the SBOM was maybe specified how that's going to be shared, that would, there might be a missed opportunity there. But all in all, again, as I said earlier, I'm optimistic, cautiously optimistic, I guess, that the strategic direction is coherent, sound, and certainly pointed in the right direction.
Thank you for joining us for part 2, Cyber Talk with Nikolai, Unpacking National Cybersecurity Strategy with Jim Ross. Stay tuned for part 3.